My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we will gorge ourselves on the sweet delights of blood in the chocolate.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. So Blood in the Chocolate is an adventure written for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. It was written by Kyle Chenier, and it features art by Jason Bradley Thompson. The story takes place in the early 17th century in the pseudo-historical setting of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. It's about a legendary chocolate factory on the Dutch coast, owned and operated by a notorious and enigmatic Spaniard named Lucia de Castillo. There are several reasons why your party might be sneaking around this chocolate factory, but ultimately it all boils down to a heist. Our Merchants Guild has hired you to pilfer one or more of a number of items, including samples of roasted cocoa beans, samples of other secret ingredients, chocolate liquor, which I should note is a term of art sort of thing for chocolate making, not chocolate-based alcohol, and Lucia's chocolate recipe. The module begins by giving the reader some background on the setting and the history of the chocolate factory, including the ancient history of the magical cocoa tree from which Lucia gets her beans. Lucia's life as a daughter of a conquistador is covered, how she acquired the magical tree and the pygmies who worship it, who she treats like slaves, and her eventual travel to Europe to build and maintain her business.
Next come a number of short chapters that relay different types of helpful information, including how to roleplay Lucia, the nature of the magical cocoa tree and the pygmies, the actual chocolate-making process, and a section on candy-based diseases and poisons. Next comes the dungeon itself, which starts at the docks where the factory receives its supplies, and has the different kinds of encounters you could expect to have there. Then comes the entrance to the factory, along with a meeting room and guest quarters, and from there you get to the heart of the factory, which is where the real weirdness begins. The factory is built across 2 stories, not including a small upper floor, where Lucia's personal quarters can be found. Many of the rooms on these 2 main stories are dedicated to different aspects of the chocolate-making process, such as the roastery, the creamery, and the packaging room.
Among these rooms are several large set pieces your characters can expect to wander into. The first is the chocolate room, which is where our Willy Wonka-style chocolate river can be found, as well as a number of sort of natural traps in the area. The pygmy village and the magical tree, which is called the old growth tree, incidentally, as well as the sort of repulsive human sacrifices that the pygmies make to the tree. All that stuff happens in that set piece. And the inventing room. This is where you will meet the tragic character Hilda Copperplate, who has been infected with a disease that puffs her up with blueberry juice. Eventually, you're expected to encounter Lucia and or rob the safe in her quarters, which has some of the more valuable items that you came to collect, such as her chocolate recipe. That is the sort of end of the adventure. In the back of the book are a number of interesting tools. There's a quick reference, NPC and monster stats, a pygmy tracker, some random tables for poisons, diseases, and magical chocolate effects. And in the very, very back of the book is a beautifully illustrated map by Jason Bradley Thompson. So why don't we just swing right into things that we liked about Blood in the Chocolate? Tom, what did you like about it?
Okay, I will start with something very prosaic, which is that the aforementioned excellent map, although I think you're talking about the one that has a kind of ongoing comic strip as well. Is that?
Yeah, there are 2 maps. Let's be clear about that. The one I talked about there at the end of the crawl was it's more of like an artistic illustrated comic strip sort of thing, right? Whereas the map you're talking about, I think, is like the functional one, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the functional map has a very functional thing throughout the module, which is that each room description, or in some cases parts of rooms, like with the old growth tree, has that section of the map kind of cut out and placed as a reference next to the text for that room. And that's not just useful for reference, but if you are like me and screen cap PDFs in order to paste the sections of the map into Google Drawings when you're running a game online.
That's what I do. Yep.
That is very useful. So full marks on that one.
Awesome. What other things did you like about it? Hi, listeners. I want to jump in here real briefly just to give a little bit of extra context to what Tom is about to talk about. In the module, we're told that Lucia, the villain, is a collector of paintings by the artist Peter Paul Rubens. And 3 of the paintings that you can find in the dungeon are also 3 of the most valuable treasures that you can acquire. They are The Last Judgment, Venus at a Mirror, and The Drunken Hercules. These are, of course, paintings in real life, except in this case, the central figure in each painting has been replaced with an image of Lucia. And so I'll just kind of read what the text has here. In The Last Judgment, we see that a clothed Lucia de Castillo is in place of Jesus. The damned figures below her all resemble Reformation/Calvinist leaders: Martin Luther, John Calvin, Henry VIII, and Julian Hernandez, most prominently. In Venus at a Mirror, we have Lucia standing in for the Venus. In The Drunken Hercules, we have Lucia in place of the titular hero. The devil, rather than shouldering Lucia, is bruised and battered in a heap at her feet. I just wanted to drop that in here because we didn't cover that in the initial rundown of the module, but I think it will be helpful to kind of understanding what Tom is about to talk about.
Well, I also liked the shout-outs to Renaissance painter Peter Paul Rubens, which is a praiseworthy endeavour in itself. But I think there could be more to this, and I don't want to dwell on this for too long because it's a massive tangent. But the fact that such a big counter-Reformation painter is patronised by Lucia, the main villain, basically it's the big tell that she's a Catholic in a Protestant country during this period. And if you keep that in mind, I don't think you'd want to make it a big plot point or anything. The module itself says she's just a bad guy. Don't worry about the motives. But that gives you potentially 3 things that will happen if you think about the fact that she is a Catholic. 1, if some of your PCs are Catholics, then you get that whole kind of someone's gone renegade from the Shaolin Temple and we need to deal with this person who's making us, who's, gone wrong, as seen in, for example, the early John Woo movie Hand of Death, co-starring Jackie Chan. Then number 2, if some or all of the party are what my late grandfather might have termed not God botherers, then you've got a sort of Brighton Rock situation. And I pulled up a Graham Greene quote for this because why not? In a letter to the theatre impresario Lawrence Pollinger, he said that Pinky and Rose, that is the Catholic characters in Brighton Rock, belong to a real world in which good and evil exist, but the interfering Ida belongs to a kind, artificial, surface world in which there is no such thing as good and evil, but only right and wrong. And so you got that going on. And the thing that made me think of this is that Lucia is kind of the embodiment of Charles Péguy's idea of the people who are willing to make great sacrifices, in this case spending loads of money on a Peter Paul Rubens painting, but not the ones that God would actually want them to make. So, not being evil. And then thirdly, if your PCs are Protestants, then you've got the setup for the novel Q by Luther Blissett. Not the former Watford and Bournemouth striker, but the quartet of Italian anarchist writers. They wrote a novel about an Anabaptist sort of secret agent crossing Europe during the turbulent times, roughly contemporaneous with Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And it's not a great book, but it is interesting. And yeah, you could do stuff with that.
Awesome. That's a really deep dive.
And in well under a minute.
It's a deep examination. That was good. I feel kind of positively pedestrian talking about the fact that I just love candy diseases. No. No, it's great. You can tell that you come from a country with a very deep and long history of Catholic and Protestant conflicts. So, fantastic.
Well, this whole module is pretty educational. This chocolate making, it's good.
To me, Blood in the Chocolate, the reason why I love it is because there are many parts of it that clearly obviously reference Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I love that it contains those elements that you can immediately recognize as inspired by those things, but it switches those things up enough for it to still feel really fresh. It doesn't feel like just kind of parody or trying to be too cute by half. It mixes things up sufficiently to where it feels like its own sort of thing. So for example, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there's a big flashback story about how Willy Wonka meets the Oompa Loompas and kind of transports them back to wherever the story takes place. I actually don't know.
I've always assumed like Birmingham or something, but I
think so. Yeah. I like that, that aspect of the novel is translated in this environment to be a story about this conquistador, right? And these South American pygmies. And I just kind of enjoy that. He takes certain things from the book and film that are kind of horrific if you think about it for a minute. For example, and kind of changes them into sequences that reflect the actual horror. So, for example, Violet Beauregard, who chews the gum when she's not supposed to and becomes a giant blueberry. If you think about that for a minute, that's kind of scary, right? It's kind of like grotesque. And so Kyle takes that notion and translates it into this like truly horrific sequence that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I think the way he treated like the inspiration and kind of translated it and made it into this thing that fits Lamentations really well as a setting and kind of amplifies the sort of implied horror of the original story, I think is great. I think the art is fabulous. It is both whimsical and repulsive. Certain illustrations reminded me of, there's like a lot of like old fashioned German children's books that are written to teach children lessons, right? Like if you're a kid who doesn't behave, this terrible thing happens to you, right? I think the most famous of those is a book called Der Struwwelpeter. And the illustrations reminded me a lot of those old German kids books of like these German kids books that are trying to teach kids to behave, right? To not do bad things. And that actually kind of fits too with the source story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which has a similar moral tale, right? So I just thought that was great. And I guess the last thing I like, big picture wise, the whole sequence, which probably happens somewhere around the middle, if you're just kind of running straight through, the whole sequence where you find the pygmy village, the big old growth tree, all the sacrificial altars they have around the tree, the disgusting wasp creatures inside the tree. That whole sequence is so great. I love it because it almost certainly follows up right after you've just had this sort of like wondrous chocolate river experience, like, oh, the chocolate river and oh, honeycomb plants and all that shit, right? And then you go into this like pygmy village area and it is described as smelling like shit and piss. And there are like blood altars and all this other disgusting shit. So I just think it's a great, great sequence.
Well, shall we move on to things we have questions about? Because I have a couple of questions.
Go for it, yeah.
Okay, so I remember a while back you mentioned, in connection with Blood in the Chocolate, the idea of sexual themes being quite a major thing. Or I may have got the wrong end of the stick at the time, actually. I think this still sort of works as a question, which is that when I read through the module, not having run it, this seemed to me kind of a sideshow is a mean way of putting it, but not that important. But, I mean, is it actually a kind of a key element of the adventure? And if that's the case, like, is there a sort of foolproof way or a better way to try and spot things that are going to be a big deal in an adventure when you're just reading it?
I wouldn't say sexual themes are a major part of this necessarily. And when we were talking about it back when, I may have, overstated the case or whatever. But I do think there are several instances where I think sex factors in, and it's in a way that you don't often see in, particularly in old school adventures, right? I think the character of Lucia, she is, in addition to being like just purely, utterly villainous, Kyle goes out of his way to say that we should not treat her like some sort of like traumatized person who's evil because they have like a bunch of like moral quandaries or they suffered some tragedy in the past. She's just straight up evil. And I kind of like that about her. But in addition to being a complete villain, she's a really sexual person. Like she's described as being like an incredibly sexual person in the way you're supposed to play her. So she fancies women, or it says very submissive, effeminate men, right? I think we're supposed to view Lucia as a very dominant sexual sort of character. And I found that super interesting. For reasons not the least of which are the fact that she's a woman, right? I don't think we often get to see this woman character, right? In any kind of media, especially games. And so I thought that was interesting. There is there's an instance of like just straight up sexual assault that happens in the dungeon, right? Which is not something we see so like explicit. A lot of times we, in lots of adventures, especially like very thoughtlessly put together ones, you have the classic someone selling nubiles in the market or whatever, right? Like that's
or some jolly illusion in relation to pirates and stuff like that.
Yeah, precisely, right? Yeah. This one just has a straight up sequence where we are meant to believe that Lucia commits sexual violence against one of her prisoners. And I found that to be a little jarring. I found it jarring. I don't know how I feel about it just in terms of like, did it actually serve the purpose? Did it serve a story purpose of making Lucia seem even more evil? I'm not sure about that. But it did stick out. And also I think that some of the candy diseases, which I'll talk a little bit about later, they just have a venereal disease quality to them, right? Like one of them straight up looks like rock candy herpes, like on your face or something. Like it's really grotesque, right? I'm probably just like reading into that a little bit, but, so yeah, I don't know if it's a major theme, but it's something that comes up, right?
Fair enough. Although, I mean, you've run this and I haven't. So in your experience, do the players get much of a chance to experience much of Lucia's character?
No, it didn't come up.
It seems like they just she shows up, attacks them probably. And,
yeah, I think it could have. I mean, I had a player character who had kind of built his backstory so that he had a relationship with Lucia. He had a sexual relationship with Lucia, and that could have come up, but it just turned out that in our adventure, in our particular run through of it, they just encountered her and killed her. We didn't. I think
that's
it could
why you should never write backstory.
Yeah, I think it could have gone that way for sure.
And just a couple of minor questions. There's a bit where the text encourages the GM to quote Willy Wonka or possibly Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. I have very dim memories of both. The bit with the wallpaper that is flavored, but then later on the chocolate boat, if a player does the same thing, quoting Willy Wonka, then the scenario tells you to punish them. What is up with that?
So I saw this note, and I didn't have time to research it, but I wonder if it's because I'd be curious to find out if one is from the book and the other's from the movie, and maybe this is just Kyle sticking out a
Wonka elitism, maybe.
Yes, some elitism going on where like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory references are okay, but Willy Wonka references are not. I actually don't know though, so worth exploring, I think though.
Okay, and my final question, you seem to like them a lot, so am I Philistine for wanting to just ignore all of the candy-themed diseases? The
candy-themed diseases, okay. See, I saw your note, and it says chocolate-themed diseases, and I thought maybe you just had a problem with the chocolate-specific ones. Yes, you are. How can you ignore them? They're so good. They are I will tell you, when I ran this, the candy themed diseases were the most fun part of the module. Like, it is what everybody loved. The players loved it. We made up our own versions of it. Yeah, it's great. Like, what don't you like about that? It's so good.
I don't know. I just started to read the list and my eyes glazed over. But I don't know. I have a really low patience threshold for that kind of thing. I will give them another shot.
I think the candy themed diseases are fantastic. Let's go to the chain lightning round.
I'll start. Number one for me is not very glamorous. It's internal PDF bookmarking. Yeah, you don't see this enough in PDFs. When it says see page 32, you click that, it goes to page 32. 10 out of 10.
I've already said it, but candy-based poisons and diseases. In particular, there's a lot of space to make up your own. When we were running it, we kind of came up with this fantastic jam-based disease, and every time it affected the player character, they puked a different flavor of jam or preserves or marmalade, so that was quite enjoyable.
Okay. My second one is the Pygmy Tracker, and generally all that reference stuff in the back. I think it's good and useful, and I also like the phrase Pygmy Tracker.
I'm going to go with the grim fate of Hilda Copperplate. I've mentioned her briefly before. She has been puffed up with blueberry juice. She's been struck by this noxious berry curse. And this is the character that Lucia routinely sexually abuses, but all because as just a sort of punishment, because Hilda was like a thief, and so she's kind of punishing this like thief who invaded her factory. But also the character Hilda, when you find her, she's strapped to this vice-like dejuicing machine, and it's coupled with a really nasty but also kind of like amusing illustration of her being juiced in this machine. And it's just kind of like disturbing and dark and sad, but also like kind of hilarious too. And I think that mix of emotions is why I love it.
All right, my last one is the guards' pay, which is when you arrive at the docks, there's a bunch of guards outside, and the text includes information on how much they get paid every day, because presumably some of the player characters might want to sign up for work and thus infiltrate the factory somehow. And I think this shows that either a good amount of playtesting was done, and they realized this needed to be in the text, or it's just really good forethought. And either way, that's a good thing. And
my last one is, there's a reference near the very end to the Heart Queen of Wavodia, who is a character from the Red and Pleasant Land Lamentations setting. There's a mirror, and you can kind of like interact with the Heart Queen. And the idea is this is a way you can introduce the Red and Pleasant Land setting to your group. So if you want to like continue the adventure in this other Lamentations product, you can do it. The Lamentations materials, especially as of late, they tend to do that. They find ways of connecting into one another, and I like that a lot. I just think it's smart. Let's go to the Expert Delve. So it's the Expert Delve. There is nothing essentially Dungeons and Dragons about this adventure, in my opinion. It doesn't really have monsters and magic items. There are a couple. Lucia wears a little locket, sort of Dorian Gray style painting effect, where this locket kind of keeps her youthful and not grotesquely obese, right? And there are these like wretched wasp creatures that live in the tree. But they're basically the exceptions. It's otherwise not a very heavy monster and magic thing. And so I don't even think you can fairly call it a dungeon crawl, honestly, the way it's laid out and kind of the way you interact with it. Because Blood in the Chocolate lacks a lot of that D&D-ness, a lot of those common D&D tropes, I think it makes it an extremely easy module to adapt to other games and circumstances. And I would like to suggest that this module would be a perfect setup for a sort of fantastical heist game. Okay. I say that because it has, the dock workers and the tower guards, which are there to be, bribed and manipulated. Most of the factory's challenges involve traps and locked doors rather than roving enemies. Much of the treasure has like just a sort of intrinsic monetary value. Again, going back to this idea that magic items don't play so heavily into it, making it pretty easy to adapt to modern pseudo-historical settings, that kind of thing. So just at the outset, what do you think about the idea of like Blood in the Chocolate as a heist setup? Yeah, well, I think that is what it is, isn't it? It's you're hired to go and pilfer some stuff. The PCs are definitely thieves if you take the adventure as its standard setting. It's just lucky for them that there's an even worse person inside to be the villain when they find her. Indeed. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess it kind of like verges on that line of like, this is another instance where it could just be that, the PCs are the assholes, right? Like when we talked about Scenic Dunsmith way back. You're correct. Yeah. It's good that Lucia is a completely despicable villain. So I'm thinking a couple of games. Blades in the Dark. I think it would be really easy to do this in Blades in the Dark. Grant Howitt's One Last Job would be another one I think would be an easy adaptation. Yeah, especially Blades in the Dark. The tech level is right there, isn't it? Sort of vaguely flintlock, gunpowder, musket armed sentries. One Last Job I'm less familiar with. Is that in a particular time period? One Last Job is more... it tells a really specific sort of genre story where we see the gang getting back together, right? If you think about like modern day heist or crime movies, there's often like a montage sequence of where we see the boss getting the crew back together, right? Like, and so, here's this guy who used to be, in his day, he was the best getaway driver there was, but now he's racing cars and, I don't know, Milan. Do they race cars in Milan? I don't know. Wherever car racing happens. Monza, I guess, if you want an Italian circuit. Yeah, no, I guess it's kind of, it's an irrelevant question in its own way, because if you have a factory, then its tech level is whatever setting you're using, and the security guard has whatever a security guard would have. It doesn't really make much difference. Yeah. What would you do
is there anything you would do differently if you were using, say, blades for this? There may not be that much conversion to do.
Not too much. The main tricky thing would be with Blades would be the setting, just because the city that Blades takes place in, Dunwall, it would never have something so decadent as this chocolate factory. The people in Dunwall they're getting by on eel and mushrooms. Okay. Like that's kind of all they've got access to.
That's
right?
true.
And so you would have to resituate things a little bit. You could imagine, for example, the chocolate factory, being a little bit closer to the imperial capital in the Blades in the Dark setting, or in some other far off land. And maybe your crew of shadows or hawkers or whatever kind of crew you have has been commissioned to go to that place to do this job. I think it's not a super difficult fix, but you couldn't just plop it right down to Dunwall. I think that would be weird.
Right. It's like an Italian
Absolutely,
job kind of set up, and then they're fish out of water comedy and all that kind of business.
Mechanically, I think running this in Blades would be dead easy. You can basically discard the stats completely, and I didn't even find that the stats were a big. I ran Blood in the Chocolate in the indie hack, which doesn't really use stats in the same way either, and it was no trouble whatsoever. Blood in the Chocolate's a lot of its traps and things, because it doesn't have tons of roving monsters. The stats just aren't super important, and because you're just kind of focused on challenges and overcoming challenges, it's perfect for Blades, because that's kind of what Blades does too. The way you could kind of like handle everything going on in the factory, you just use the Blades. If you liked it, then you should have put a clock on it. Method of managing things at the table, right? 4-segment clocks for pygmy alerts in any given area, or for tower guard alerts. A 6 or 8-segment clock before Lucia is aware of the invasion, that kind of thing. A 4-segment clock for how long it takes the wasps to descend from the tree branches, if you want to stick with the wasps. There's just lots of opportunities to basically just clock everything out, right?
Yeah, and that's a bit of prep I would want to do beforehand, because actually I found that doing clocks on the fly is not hard, but I always feel like I'm making it too hard or too easy. So I'd want to slightly consider that maybe the day before I ran it, and just stick a clock next to each section of the
I think it'd be as simple as just going through the
probably,
book and just kind of highlighting like areas of like where a clock might be relevant or helpful, right? Pretty simple stuff. I think Blades is perfect in a lot of ways. In addition to the fact that Blood in the Chocolate is mostly just about overcoming challenges, there are also plenty of excellent opportunities to invoke the flashback mechanic in Blades. You could imagine, for example, a very pretty slide character, a female slide character, right? Wooing Lucia during some sort of social event to learn something about some of the factory's defenses. A female slide, or I suppose an easily dominated male
a submissive male
slide,
slide,
you can imagine a spider character working out the exact shipping and receiving times of the factory in order to assist in a prowl action to get inside the building, or a cutter beating the living shit out of the tower guard so he doesn't show up to work that day. Like, you can imagine all kinds of cool flashback scenarios for this. And there's also a lot of excellent opportunities for the Blades mechanic called Devil's Bargain. In Blades, this is basically you can take a Devil's Bargain to get, which is like a little complication to the situation in order to get a dice bonus, right? So you could, have a Devil's Bargain of, you get an extra die for escaping, but Lucia will recognize you on your way out and make your life hell afterward. Or you can get an extra die for breaking into the safe, but it turns out Lucia has a candy disease trap on the safe, that kind of thing.
I think there's actually a really good way to encourage people to do Devil's Bargains here as well, because one thing I found when running Blades was that the players were loath to come up with anything particularly devilish, or again, they're worried about pitching it too hard or too easy. But you could just give everyone the list of candy diseases and say, if you can't think of a Devil's Bargain, here it is. And then the other thing is the flashbacks. We've spoken about how it's hard to get into Lucia's backstory, because by the time you meet her, she's already shooting at you. But, if you flash back to meeting her at society balls or just whatever other kind of interaction, then, there you are. And the GM gets a chance to use those role-playing tips.
I that's actually a great insight. One of the things I found disappointing about when I ran it in the indie hack is, I kind of hard framed it and put them right at the factory, right? And there, like we kind of alluded to earlier, there weren't many chances to show Lucia, right? There weren't many chances to explore that history. They were too busy, having peanut brittle disease in their throat or whatever, right? Or whatever it was, right? Which was very fun, but we didn't get to see some of those aspects. So yeah, you're right. The Blades flashback thing would be terrific to do that, right?
And what about one last job? Is there anything particular for that differs greatly from Blades that you should be aware of?
One last job, like I said before, it's more of a modern day setting. It doesn't have to be though, right? I mean, it's basically a very rules light system for showing a heist, like the dramatic beats of a heist after you get the gang back together. So it's kind of two big sequences, getting the gang back together and then doing the heist, right? And the setting is irrelevant. Like you could have it be in this setting. It's no big deal. It's a little bit more abstract in its implementation, but it would have a lot of the same functionality here. Like there are flashback scenes, there are mechanics for planning things, like all that stuff. For example, there's a portion of the Chocolate River room where there's a bridge, and the bridge is extremely slippery, and getting across the slippery bridge is a big part of it. In One Last Job, you would go up to that bridge, you would narrate being at that bridge, and then you would immediately cut to a planning scene, which is like a flashback planning thing, showing how you acquired special shoes, to get across that bridge, that kind of thing. For many of the same reasons that like Blood and the Chocolate would work in Blades, it would also work in One Last Job. Principally that, it's about just overcoming a series of obstacles. Okay.
And actually, I think the flashbacks from both these games are something you could think about importing to, whatever OSR system you're using to run this. Well, okay, let me give some background on this. I'm a total soft touch as a GM, right? So, and especially online where everyone's sitting around doing equipment shopping is not good. So I tend to let people buy equipment in retrospect. So as long as it's something not obvious, right? So you couldn't get an extra 10-foot pole that we had not seen you carrying around before, but anything that could fit in your bag or in a pocket or, a boot. So if you need that extra dagger, you can say, I've got that, and then spend the money that you have left over and say you bought it back in town. And so even if you don't want to let people do that generally, if you're approaching a kind of heisty adventure like this, then it's probably a good time to bring it into your
that's
game.
Actually a great point. As we've been talking about this, I was thinking, if I were going to run this as a more traditional sort of dungeon crawl or in a system that's more focused on like a dungeon crawl, for me, that would be World of Dungeons or Dungeon World, right? You could just do the flashbacks, right? Like there's no reason why you couldn't just do it, right? Yeah. Like you could just incorporate those bladesy, heisty elements into it, like easy peasy.
Yeah. In Blades, the constraint is stress, but in World of Dungeons, which is what I tend to use, it's just how much cash you've still got in the kitty. So it's
even in Dungeon World, right? Like you have your adventuring gear is abstracted, right? Like you could just it's a similar idea, right? Yeah. Like you kind of plan. We show the planning like when it's in, like when we need it, like not we don't spend too much time up front doing it.
Yeah. So I did have another thought though about the heist in general. Okay, and that is that I feel like as presented, the factory is a little bit 2D. And what I mean by that is that heists, if we think about the movies or video games or anything like that, they tend to operate in 3 dimensions. And there's a little bit of that already in Blood and the Chocolate. Like there's the conveyor belts that go between the production rooms, and you can sort of hop up on them and you'll emerge above the kind of working floor of the next room. And I would kind of want to read through it and try and imagine spaces that could connect unconventionally between different rooms so that people have more than one way to get from place to place, so not just having to kind of kick down doors and just burst in or whatever would normally happen if you have to go in the conventional way.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, you're right. The module as written does have a few places like that, like the conveyor belts. And I want to say there's even there's a section with like ducts and shafts too. I could be misremembering that.
I was about to say that I think there, and I think like the basement can be got to through the Chocolate River, and there's some pipes or something in there. Gosh, I wish I had the PDF open right now, but never mind. But I think just kind of think in those terms when you're reading through the module would be a good way to plan what's
great advice. You have a note here about door kicking XCOM fun. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, just like on the other hand, maybe doing it all 2-dimensionally is okay. So you could play a kind of thing like instead of a heist, it'd be more like a SWAT raid. If you're playing something like Stay Frosty or God, I don't know, Recon. Nobody plays Recon, what am I saying? Like you could just do it pretty straight ahead, 2-dimensional action and adventure, and that would still be pretty great.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually not a bad segue. One of the things we talked about when we were getting ready for this episode was if you're going to play this in Blades, it doesn't even have to be a heist, right? It could be you could imagine a Blades setup that's not about going in and grabbing the chocolate recipe at all.
Yeah, if you think about the other crew types that are in Blades in the Dark, so for assassins and shadows, which is to say assassins and I guess they're like spies.
Thieves.
thieves. So they would have something pretty similar to the current default assumption. You're sort of infiltrating, doing a job, and getting out. But if you've got a crew of bravos, which is like kind of bully boys and thugs who run rackets in the streets, I don't know. The only thing I could think of there was like just knocking on the door to demand protection money, but I'm not sure if that's the best route in.
You may not
for
get
them.
to experience much of the dungeon that way, or much of the adventure.
Yeah, you check out the paintings, get killed.
There's some promising stuff on the other crew types, I think, though, such as the cults. Like if you had a crew of cultists, I think maybe you're infiltrating the factory not to steal chocolate making ingredients and recipes, but you are invading the factory because the old growth tree, which is a magical tree that has a bunch of like shamanic spirits in it, maybe that's part of your cult, motivation. Maybe you worship the tree also, or maybe
like you're maybe recovering it from because
you're forgotten. Maybe the forgotten god
good.
you worship is connected to it in some way, right? You can imagine a situation with. You would change the frame slightly if your crew were hawkers or smugglers, right? Hawkers and smugglers. Hawkers kind of set up like sales transactions, and smugglers curry things, illegally from place to place. If you have one of those crew types, the way you interact with the factory would be entirely different, right? Like you may be more focused on the docks portion, right? Like then and the shipping and receiving portion. Or maybe you're in the factory to set up a deal with Lucia, right? And maybe it goes south and you have to cope with some of the things in the factory. There's lots of different, I think depending on your crew type.
Yeah. Like, you could just, encounter one of an escaped prisoner or something, and then you'd have to decide immediately what to do about it. Do I ignore this pitiful person trying to kind of begging for help? Or do I just seal this very lucrative deal that I've got on the table?
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's in that case, the adventure becomes more of like just like a little mini sandbox, or just a big, box of elements and a grab bag fun things that you can just like use in whatever frame you need it in, right? And in that sense, I think it's really great. Particularly great. I quite enjoy the module. I'm very fond of it, and so I could see myself having a lot of fun, like playing with those different elements.
Yeah, I think there's also a civic responsibility angle, which is that, if you're playing Bluecoats, or if let me tell you about my character moment. When I was running Blades, I was the GM, but the players were playing the staff of an anarcho-feminist newspaper in the 19th century in the real world. And they spent quite a lot of time breaking a slavery ring that was still operating. So I think if you look at it as the pygmies are, they're slaves, right? So, a lot of people could be interested in finding out what happened to these people who were kidnapped from Peru and helping them, or setting them free at least, which might not be quite as helpful as you would hope. But yeah, I think that's a good positive motivation you could have. That's not, all the others are a little bit larcenous, and I think freeing the indentured laborers would be a nice change.
Yeah. I mean, that's terrific. There's so much interesting, grabby backstory and elements and cultural things and all kinds of stuff going on in this module that, like, it feels a shame not to explore it,
Yeah, it's got real depths. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's go to companion adventures. It's the companion adventures. Why don't we start with music, since we both have a music recommendation? What's your music recommendation, Tom?
Okay. So my music recommendation is the traditional hocketing and yodeling of pygmy music in sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, I know the pygmies in the module are not actual pygmies, but let's just go with it. So hocketing is a thing in music also found in the Balinese Kachak, where, how to explain this? The melody is carried by different people, like one note at a time. So like person A will sing, note A, person C will sing the C above it, and the tune goes back and forth between them. If you've seen the Muppaphone sketch in the Muppets, where each of them says ow in a different pitch, thing like that, but without the violence. And the other thing is they also do this kind of yodeling, which is quite distinctive. And indeed, so, my minor courses in ethnomusicology at university are really paying off now I'm on this podcast. So I distinctly recall being forced to stand in a circle of about 20 students and do hocketing yodeling. That was great. Anyway, so the point is, look for this on YouTube by searching for Bayaka Pygmy Music. That's Bayaka, or simply Aka, Pygmy Music, aka, and you'll find some, just sort of recordings done by various ethnomusicologists of this
I'm very
stuff.
impressed. You've managed to connect the traditional music of these people to some gory Oompa Loompas and Muppets. So, nice job.
Yeah, well, I live to serve.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
All right. What's your music, Smarty Pants?
When I read this module, and indeed when I ran it, I always have like tango music in my mind. I don't know why, but tango music like really sticks in my brain. Maybe it's because tango comes from a part of the world that had, that had like colonial influences or whatever. I don't know. But rather than just like the sort of like standard, bum bum tango, I'm thinking Nuevo Tango would be great here. The tango music of Astor Piazzolla specifically would be a really nice fit for a pop culture touchstone. If anybody needs to know who Astor Piazzolla is, his music was used as a soundtrack for the original 12 Monkeys movie. But I've been familiar with his work for a long time for different reasons, principally that I am best friends with a person who plays piano for a Piazzolla cover band, basically. Well, they're called the Austin Piazzolla Quintet.
It's pretty niche,
It's
I have
pretty
to say.
niche.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's great. I've got some tracks for you, which I think are, kind of really punchy, up-tempo, but also a little dark and mysterious and perfect for this module. You will have to search them by track name because, like a lot of traditional and classical music, like there aren't just like albums, right? Like you have to like kind of, there's tons of collections and things. Libertango is one track. Fugata is another. Otoño Porteño is another. And then Milonga del Angel. And I'll have those listed out in the show notes for you.
Okay, well, my next companion adventure is a video game, which is actually, we've been talking about Blades, which is essentially Dishonored, the role-playing game. We started out that way anyway, and so it should be no surprise that I recommend Dishonored just to get good kind of visual and spatial feel for this kind of factory. I especially recommend The Knife of Dunwall, which is a DLC thing for it, in which the first mission has you infiltrate a huge whaling factory, kind of industrial plant. And I think that would be a great sort of touchstone for the chocolate factory. I probably recommend just looking for some playthroughs on the internet, simply because it is DLC, and I don't think I can kind of urge you to spend so much money just to check it out for running some D&D. But I think the games are great, and maybe you will too. But even if not, take a look at them, and you'll see some good industrial fantasy stuff.
I have a film recommendation, originally recommended to me by Tom, and I thought about it for a minute and decided, sure, why not? There's a 1980s horror movie called The Stuff. It's about ice cream that invades your body and takes over your mind, and occasionally the characters' mouths stretch open in grotesque ways as this white ice cream material kind of explodes out of them, crawls out of them. It's a sort of body horror confection, right? And I think that's appropriate for a little bit of flavor.
Nice. I haven't actually seen it, but I just remembered you talking about it. So
it's terrible, and also one of the best horror movies.
I was about to ask, is it actually good?
No, it's just awful,
Okay.
but enjoyable. I love it. I run a Monster of the Week scenario based off it. That's always really popular.
Okay, my last one is a bit of TV, which is the Futurama episode where they go to the Slurm factory. Slurm in the series is a soft drink that is highly addictive and turns out to have a hideous, grisly secret. The episode, I looked it up, Season 1, Episode 13, Fry and the Slurm Factory. So basically, you could have just put that brief description into Google. You would have got it anyway. I like this because it's another way of looking at Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and making it into something weirdly grotesque. And, it's like 25 minutes long. Probably worth your time.
Well, that's our show, listeners. If you want to get in touch with us, there are different ways of doing that. The main one is to go to our community page on Google+. Just go to the community section of Google+ and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We are on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Oh, hey, Tom, before we go, I've been thinking about changing the name of the podcast. We're a few episodes in, and I think it's just, it's not really holding up for me. Do you have any recommendations for what else we could call it?
I did have another idea just the other day. See what you think. It's like Thaco, and that's the way it is.
There's this white ice cream material kind of splooges out of them. That's a terrible word.